Okay, so hello everyone, and thanks for this opportunity to speak to you today. I'm speaking from Ireland. I'm an Irish journalist, and I've been covering COVID right throughout. I've been particularly looking at it from a church point of view and how the COVID restrictions have affected public worship, not just in Ireland, but overseas as well. I think what makes Ireland stand out is the fact that we had the strictest restrictions on public worship of any country in Europe. If you go back to last year when the COVID pandemic first began to break out, I could only find one country in Europe that stopped public worship, not at all, and that was Sweden. It allowed public worship for the entire time that the pandemic has existed, even though it did place severe limits on the numbers who could attend church. But every other part of Europe stopped public worship in at least one lockdown. They all did so in the first lockdown starting last February or March. But then some allowed public worship faster than others. Sometimes it took court cases or direct intervention from the bishops. In your own country, for example, as far as I remember, the bishops protested in May of last year when museums were allowed to reopen, but you couldn't go to Mass. The bishops won the day, and public worship has not stopped in Italy since. In France, a traditionalist Catholic group took a case and they won. In Germany, a Muslim group took a case and also won. Courts judged the issue of proportionality. Did public health considerations warrant a public health ban, or was it disproportionate and unjustified? Was society actually being made safer by stopping public worship? Courts also looked at the issue of discrimination. Were some sectors being allowed to reopen before places of worship? In Ireland, as I say, we had the longest lockdowns of anywhere. We had 3 lockdowns in total, and we could not go to Mass for about 42 weeks out of 60 weeks. We were finally allowed to go back to Mass in May, but with limited numbers still. At one point in autumn of last year, you could go to a hairdresser or to a gym, but not to Mass. I spoke to one of our public health experts and I asked him why this was so. And he said, well, in the context of a pandemic, decisions are made to close things considered less important. So what he was basically saying is it was more important to be able to go to a hairdresser or to a gym, but not to Mass. Court cases have been taken in Ireland, but either they were lost or the case wasn't heard at all. In Ireland, in fact, at one point, we became the only country in Europe to make it an actual criminal offence to attend public worship or hold a service aside from very small funerals or weddings. So that was the first time in centuries where it was illegal to go to Mass, or indeed, as I say, to any other form of public worship. And this was never tested in the courts, despite our constitution. In England, public worship was stopped in the first lockdown, and again for a short time last autumn. But then all the faith leaders in England objected. They wrote a letter to Boris Johnson. This was the Hindus, the Muslims, the Jews, the Protestants, the Catholics. And they demanded evidence that another public worship ban was justified. But no evidence could be found, and the ban was lifted and never again reimposed, not even in the big wave after last Christmas. Now we see that some countries are imposing restrictions again and even lockdowns. So what will happen to public worship this coming Christmas? Hopefully it'll still be allowed to continue, even if there's restrictions. Now let's look forward a little bit. What will be the effect of all the restrictions we've had on levels of worship going into the future? So I don't know what the effect has been on attendance levels in Italy and elsewhere. But in Ireland, we've done opinion polling. And in Ireland, only about half of the number of people who were going to Mass before the pandemic have come back. This means the percentage of weekly Mass goers in Ireland has dropped from about 25% of the population to only about 12%. And the question is, will those people ever come back? Have they permanently lost the habit of going? Opinion polls show too many are still too scared to return, and others don't like coming with all the social distancing and other restrictions in place. it makes coming to Mass seem too unwelcoming and too forbidding. And about 25% of people say they either won't be back or don't know if they'll come back. But I suspect the longer we have restrictions, the more people won't come back. And in my opinion, this means that the decline of church attendance in Ireland has accelerated probably by between 5 and 10 years. This means the pandemic will have a long-term effect on the churches, certainly in Ireland. Now, I think that what we've been going through provides a litmus test for how well regarded and respected churches are in society. It's also been a litmus test for how well we balance freedom versus safety. It's been a litmus test for the churches themselves. How do we balance freedom of worship against public safety? In some countries, churches have simply listened completely uncritically to public health experts without resistance and without asking for evidence showing it is necessary to totally stop public worship. In other countries, churches have been quicker to stand up to public health experts and governments and to make their case for restarting public worship. And as I say, they've sometimes taken court cases and won. I think the attitude of the churches often comes down to self-confidence. And of course, in Ireland, the Catholic Church has been very badly affected by the scandals. And so this has made it easier to sideline the churches, not just the Catholic Church, and not listen to their voices. Now, just a few more general observations before I finish. There was a very prominent priest philosopher from Austria back in the 1960s and 70s named Ivan Illich, I-L-L-I-C-H. So he was extremely critical of what he believed was medical overreach. That is, doctors wanting us to see everything through the eyes of public health. He predicted that one day, in a time of crisis, doctors would be given the power of generals in war. And that day has certainly arrived. And as I say, this is what Ivan Illich predicted. It is up to other sectors of society to reduce doctors and public health back down to size, or too much power will be given to public health experts permanently. I believe the churches have a role of their own to play here. Fighting for religious freedom in a sensible and proportionate manner is a way of fighting for the freedom of society in general and making people realize that the common good cannot be reduced to public health alone. And by the way, I'm not arguing against any restrictions. I'm just arguing in favor of proportionate ones. And of course, from a church point of view, public health is not the most important thing, even though it is important. The most important thing is spiritual health. The churches, above all, must never forget this. And priests and other religious leaders must never forget that they are doctors of the soul, first and foremost, and must never let themselves become glorified health and safety officers. Thank you for your time. Bye-bye.